Hello, and thank you so much for joining me today. This session is Barking Up the Right Tree Dog Licenses in Irish Genealogy. My name is Jen Baldwin. I'm the research specialist for Find My Past, and I'm really delighted to be a part of this conference. Thank you so much. Now, before we get started, I want to mention that all the dogs you will see in this presentation today are proud members of the Find My Past family. And I want to give a quick shout out and a thanks to my colleagues all across the UK for sharing their beloved best friends with me for this purpose. Now, Irish genealogy, we all know, can be a little bit tricky, a little bit confusing, and sometimes you end up just a little bit topsy turvy, like poor Ollie here. Irish genealogy requires creativity and kind of outside of the box thinking. And if you don't know why, there's a lot of record destruction, but there's also a lot of change across Ireland, right? The famine creates mass migration. There's a lot of politics involved with the suppression of the Irish through English government. There's factors that play into both world wars, for example. So there's a whole number of reasons why Irish genealogy can be complicated. However, at Find My Past, we don't think that it's impossible. And one of the reasons that we are trying to approach the question of Irish genealogy is by finding creative resources to assist the family historian in answering those basic questions that we normally would get from census records or parish baptisms, marriages, and burials. Without those tools, we have to think a little bit outside the box ourselves. And that is one of the reasons why we introduced the Irish dog license registers online several years ago now. So, this is intended to be a little bit of a refresh if you haven't used the collection for a while, or if you're brand new to this material, an introduction for you and how it applies to your family history journey. The Irish dog license registers were introduced into law in 1865. So the first licenses were actually issued in 1866. They offer details about your ancestors through their canine companions. So it's a great resource because it's an annual event. They had to register their dogs every year, and it records that basic human information that we're all looking for. The cost to license your dog was originally 2 shillings per dog with an extra sixpence in administration costs. So you'll see those numbers a lot because, of course, this is a license register. So the point is to collect those funds. They were issued at the same courts where petty sessions were held. So these types of records are often found under the court record category on our favorite genealogy search providers. The registration fee was significantly less than the penalty if you were caught with an unlicensed dog, as we can see through the historical newspaper collection, which tells us all about the dog license. Right? The idea of using newspapers in conjunction with a record set like this is to really understand the context, right? At some point, they introduce a new law. They have to tell the people about that law so that they can, in fact, be compliant. Newspapers were the way in which they did that. Now, as they found people who were not compliant, you find those names in the newspaper as well. And we'll show you a couple examples of that as we go forward. The dog license, year one of the dog licenses saw more than 350,000 issued, and they generated 35,000 pounds in revenue. So right away, the courts saw that this was a major source of funding. But the numbers of licenses started to average out. So years after that initial first year, start to kind of average around 250,000 licenses per year. So to put this into context a little bit, 2 shillings 6 pence in 1866 represents about a half a day's wage to a standard farm laborer. The annual license today is 20 euros per pound if you're interested, or 20 euros per dog, I'm sorry, if you're interested. And the large number of dogs that were licensed every year, of course, makes these registers a very valuable resource for tracing your family history because they, particularly in the pre census years of 1866 to 1900, where those records are no longer available to us. And it's harder to identify individual people in individual locations. So the licenses were really introduced to make it easier to identify the owners of dogs, especially those who were maybe not behaving the way they wanted to, right? People or dogs that pestered sheep or damaged property. It was easier to figure out which human that dog was attached to with these license registers. We can also measure some trends through these records. We know that lap dogs and toy dogs start to appear in the 19th century, mostly Pomeranians and poodles. We know that family pets were typically constrained to just a handful of breeds: spaniels, hounds, setters, pointers, terriers, mastiffs, and bulldogs, almost exclusively. Unlike today, of course, when we have a huge range of breeds being represented across both work dogs and as family pets. And of course, most of these were, in fact, work dogs of some kind, right? Collies were often sheep dogs. Terriers and spaniels were often used in hunting. Newfoundlands were typically found near the coastal areas because they have a natural love for water and so forth. So we can kind of study not just our ancestors in this time and place, but we can also consider how many dogs were in a particular village or a various parish, and what types of dogs were popular from place to place across the country, which makes for an interesting little look at some of the history around the community that you're researching in. Now, for the collection itself, there were 1,200 total registers, so 1,200 total books, if you will. They include 6 million human names. And of course, we know that most farmers had dogs. So if you suspect or you know that your Irish ancestor was in agricultural labor of some kind, then you probably want to look at this register just to make sure, see if you can find that person or not. If we get into the registers themselves, they include the name, address, and county for the person that owns the dog, the year and date of the license, and that includes the cost of the license as well. And then a brief description of the dog, which includes their color, their breed, and their sex. Now, some of the registers also recorded the name of the dog. It's not as common as maybe some of us would like, but it is in there for certain locations. Now, when you start to get into the collection, of course, we all want to go straight to the name search and start to dig around and see what we can find. But I would encourage you to consider the collection as a whole. Go back to the very first page and preview the first couple of pages of each register that you're interested in. Make sure that you're seeing any kind of extra notations, if any exist, or understanding kind of maybe restrictions on the location. Now, a lot of this is in the transcription information as well, of course, but it's always good practice to go back and look at those pages for yourself, just in case there was something that didn't quite fit into the transcription format. And you want to make sure that you capture that information. So it's always good to go back to the start of any kind of manuscript or register book and look at those first few initial pages. They will look like this. Okay, so just to show you a couple of examples, this is an entry from the 3rd of May, 1866, from Kildorrery Court. And this actually represents a female dog owner, which is also kind of an exciting little bit about this register that I think a lot of people don't really think about, right? We think about farmers having dogs, but farmers are traditionally men, right? In this instance, though, we can find women who have documented their pets as well or licensed their pets. So in this case, Bridget Dwans is listed as a resident at Quit Rent Mountain. She registers two dogs, actually, a female white and black bulldog who is of middle size, and then a male black small terrier. And again, this is 1866, so before parish registers, and we have this wonderful entry of Bridget and her residence. And we also know that she has enough money at least to have two dogs. We can see a number of images and examples in which we find those names of the pet that I mentioned earlier. In this case, they're in the right-hand margin on that extra notes column. So we have Captain and Charlie and Major joined by the actual dog Charlie, who lives in England right now. So there's some common names across the collection, right? Charlie is a relatively common uh, dog name, we think, but we don't see a lot of captains and majors anymore. And so maybe some of those militaristic style names for our pets are going a little bit out of fashion. This page is from County Louth or Queens County from 1866. We also want to think about what happens if our ancestor is in this register and then suddenly disappears. And that can give us some theories and allow us to create a couple hypotheses. Now, the answer you might think of right away is that, well, the dog passes away. But if they have a dog, especially a work dog, they are likely to get another one. So they should still show up in the register. So we want to think about whether or not the human has passed away or possibly immigrated. So we're not going to jump to any conclusions like Toast here, making this fantastic jump. But we do want to think about the ramifications or the reasons why our ancestor might suddenly stop showing up in the registers. And we talked a little bit about newspapers. I want to give you a couple examples as well. It can be a great addition to your research, especially again when people failed to license their dog. This is an entry from 1906, actually showing a handful of names of people who failed to do so. So they are actually taken into court and fined as the law required. We also get a sense of kind of the history and the context around the register. So in this case, this is 1911 from Galway, and they're saying that there's actually an extra 25 pounds accumulated through the licenses. And so they were going to redirect that funding to the Galway Urban Council. You also probably want to look at this register in conjunction with the petty session court registers. Remember at the beginning, I said that they're often the licenses were issued from the same locations. They're often kind of mixed in with court records. But in terms of finding people who didn't license their pets, this is another source. So we can do that through newspapers. We can do that through petty session court registers. So this is a list of people who actually were found to not have licensed their pet. And so we can kind of look at this in the opposite direction. So this is from 1873 in Swords, Dublin, and it shows 8 people being forced into a license, right? License granted directly by the court, including an Elizabeth Watson, who's actually just right there at the top. Now, when we then go back to the dog license registers, we see that Elizabeth is number one, it's abbreviated in 2 different ways. But we also have a register for her in Swords, Dublin from 1871, 1872, and 1875. So she misses 1873 and 1874 for some reason, which is why she ends up in the court records, in the petty session court records. But then we do find her again in the dog license registers appropriately, licensing her animals the next year. So we would invite you to take a look at these registers, maybe have a little bit of a play or see what happens. See if you can make a discovery. If you've seen them before, take another look. You never know. And we would really ask if you've taken a look, right? If you have dug into these, be curious like a good pup. Sniff and smell around for your ancestors in every resource that you can find for them, and think about the options and the opportunity for Irish research in some unusual locations. Thank you so much for watching today, and I hope you have enjoyed this. And we will see you next year for all about that place.